Imagine this. You are lying in bed on a Tuesday night. Nothing unusual, nothing different. The same house you have lived in for 20 years, the same street, the same neighbours. And then your phone rings. It is your elderly mother. She is crying. She can barely speak. Someone has broken into her home. She locked herself in the bathroom. She can hear them moving through her rooms, going through her things, taking whatever they want. You tell her to call the police. She already did. They told her someone would be with her as soon as possible. She waited 47 minutes alone in that bathroom before anyone arrived. The burglars were long gone. Nothing was recovered. Nobody was arrested. The case was closed within a week, marked as a statistic. One of the 94 out of every 100 burglaries in Britain that never result in a single charge. 94 out of 100. That is not a failure rate. That is an announcement. It is the British state telling you, in the clearest possible language, that your home is not protected, that your possessions are not protected, that the people you love are not protected. And for years, for decades, Britain has accepted this, has shrugged, has filed the insurance claim, has replaced the laptop and the jewellery and the sense of safety and tried to move on. One man has decided that is no longer acceptable. His name is Rupert Lowe, and the policy he is proposing to fix it is so simple, so obvious, and so aggressively resisted by the British establishment that understanding why it has been blocked for so long tells you everything you need to know about who the political system in this country actually serves. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what Lowe is proposing to change about Britain's policing and crime laws, why the establishment has fought these changes for decades, and what Britain would look like if the policy platform he is building ever made it into government. Let us start with the translation services story, because this is the one that most people dismiss as a minor administrative detail, and that turns out to be one of the most revealing windows into how the British state has changed over the past 20 years. Walk into almost any NHS hospital in England today. Walk into a GP surgery, a benefits office, a housing authority, a council tax department, a court, and you will find a system that has, quietly and without any democratic mandate, built an enormous parallel infrastructure for people who do not speak English. Translation services, interpreter bookings, multilingual forms, staff trained to communicate in dozens of languages, signage in Arabic, Urdu, Polish, Romanian, Punjabi, Somali. The cost of this infrastructure is significant. NHS England spends hundreds of millions of pounds annually on translation and interpretation services. Local councils spend tens of millions more. The court system has its own budget. The Home Office has its own. Nobody voted for this. Nobody was asked whether they wanted their NHS budget, money raised from their taxes, from their payslips, from the national insurance contributions they have been making since their first job, to be spent on providing services in languages other than English to people who have chosen to live in an English-speaking country. It simply happened. Gradually, service by service, department by department, without debate, without accountability, without a single politician standing up and saying, "This is the choice we are making, and here is why we think it is the right one." Rupert Lowe's position is simple and direct. You live in England, you speak English, not as a preference, not as a guideline, as a condition of accessing taxpayer-funded public services. If you require medical treatment in an emergency, if you are brought into an accident, an emergency department unable to communicate, of course a translator will be found. Nobody in Restore Britain's platform is suggesting people should die because they cannot speak English. That is a deliberate misrepresentation of what is being proposed. What is being proposed is the end of the routine, permanent, institutionalised provision of translation services as a standard feature of public service delivery in England. The assumption that every government department, every NHS trust, every council housing office must be equipped to communicate in dozens of languages at public expense. The argument Lowe makes is straightforward. The provision of translation services as a permanent feature of public life removes one of the primary incentives for learning English. If a new arrival can access housing, benefits, healthcare, and legal services in their own language, the practical urgency of learning English The language of the country they have chosen to live in is reduced, and the consequences of that reduction are not abstract, they are visible. In communities across England where significant populations have been present for decades and where English proficiency among older residents remains limited, where children serve as interpreters for their parents at GP appointments, where community integration, the thing that makes immigration economically and socially viable, has simply not happened because the incentives for integration were never created. The counter-argument made by the liberal establishment, by diversity and inclusion professionals, by the political class that created this system, is that translation services are a humanitarian necessity, that refusing them denies vulnerable people access to services they are entitled to, that it is discriminatory to require English as a condition of service. Lowe's response is that the discrimination runs in the other direction, that it is discriminatory against every English-speaking taxpayer to take money from their wages and spend it on a system that actively discourages the integration that makes a functioning, cohesive society possible, that the humane thing, the thing that actually serves the long-term interests of immigrant communities, is to create the conditions in which English is learned, in which people can participate fully in economic and social life, in which the next generation does not inherit the same linguistic isolation as the first. This is not a fringe position. It is the position of every mainstream country that has successfully managed large-scale immigration. Germany, France, the Netherlands, Canada, Australia. All of them require language acquisition as a condition of permanent residence and citizenship. All of them provide language learning support to help people meet that requirement. None of them provide permanent, institutionalized translation as a substitute for it. Britain, uniquely, built the translation infrastructure and forgot to build the requirement. Lowe wants to reverse that, not overnight, not by cutting off services without transition, but deliberately, with a clear statement of direction. This country speaks English, and we are going to structure our public services around that fact. Now let us talk about what this actually costs, because the numbers, when you see them, are genuinely shocking. NHS England's translation and interpretation bill runs to hundreds of millions of pounds annually. The figure has grown every year for the past decade. It now represents a meaningful proportion of the NHS operational budget in some trusts, money that is not being spent on nurses, on waiting lists, on cancer treatments, on mental health services, on the thousand things that English-speaking patients are waiting months and years for. Local government translation costs are harder to track because they are distributed across hundreds of councils with varying reporting standards. But independent estimates put the combined annual spend at over £100 million. Some individual London boroughs spend millions per year on translation alone. The court system has its own interpretation budget running to tens of millions annually. The immigration and asylum system, where translation requirements are heaviest, adds hundreds of millions more. Total annual public sector translation spend in England is, by any credible estimate, well in excess of £1 billion, £1 billion per year, spent on a service that no democratic vote ever authorised, that no political party ever stood on a manifesto platform and said we are going to spend £1 billion of your taxes on this, and here is why. It simply accumulated, year by year, department by department, without scrutiny, without accountability, without anyone in the political class ever being required to justify it to the people whose money it is. Lowe is the first mainstream politician to put a number on it and say, this is a choice, and it is the wrong one. The savings from ending routine translation provision across the public sector would not solve the NHS funding crisis. They would not eliminate waiting lists overnight, but they would represent a deliberate reallocation of public money from a service that discourages integration to services that directly benefit every taxpayer equally, and they would send a signal. A clear, unmistakable, long overdue signal that choosing to live in England comes with an expectation. The expectation that you participate in the shared civic life of the country, that you learn its language, that you contribute to its culture as well as drawing on its services. That signal has not been sent for 20 years. The consequences are visible in every English city where parallel communities exist, prosperous, insular, and functionally disconnected from the broader society around them. Not because of malice, because the incentives for connection were never created. Let us now address the obvious objection, because it is going to come up, and it deserves a serious answer. What about people who have been here for decades, who are elderly, who arrived before English language requirements existed, who have been part of their communities for a generation, and who genuinely cannot learn English at this stage of their lives? It is a real question, and Lowe's platform, to its credit, does not ignore it. The proposal is not retrospective. It does not pull the rug from under elderly residents who built their lives under a different system. The transition applies to new arrivals, to new applications, to new interactions with public services. The existing provision for people with genuine long-term need remains in place during any transition period. What it does is stop the infrastructure from growing, stop new translation requirements from being added, stop the expansion of a system that was never democratically authorized and that has demonstrably failed to produce the integration outcomes that were its implicit justification. Is this harsh? By the standards of the current political consensus, yes. By the standards of every other developed country that has successfully managed mass immigration, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, it is simply the normal expectation of nationhood. Britain got comfortable with a different standard. And the results, the integration failures, the parallel communities, the £1 billion annual translation bill, are the direct consequence of that comfort. Lowe is asking Britain to get uncomfortable again, to make the choice that every other successful immigration country made. That language is not optional, that integration is not voluntary, and that the public services funded by taxpayers exist primarily to serve a society with a common language and a shared civic identity. Let us talk about policing. Because the translation policy does not exist in isolation. It is part of a broader Restore Britain platform on crime and public safety that connects directly to the story this video started with. The 94% non-detection rate for burglary in Britain is not primarily a resource problem. It is not primarily a funding problem. It is a priority problem. Police forces across England have over the past decade made explicit decisions about what they investigate and what they do not. Property crime, burglary, theft, criminal damage has been progressively deprioritised in favour of what the College of Policing euphemistically calls harm-based approaches. Resources have been redirected toward online hate speech investigations, toward non-crime hate incidents, toward the recording and filing of speech and expression that does not meet the threshold for criminal prosecution, but that someone somewhere found offensive. In 2023 alone, British police forces recorded approximately 120,000 non-crime hate incidents. Reports filed, officers deployed, hours spent on things that are not crimes, while 94 out of every 100 actual crimes against property, real crimes with real victims, with real losses, went unsolved. Lowe's policing platform is built on reversing that priority order, on directing police resources toward the crimes that affect ordinary people's daily lives, burglary, theft, violent crime, antisocial behaviour, and withdrawing them from the recording and investigation of speech and expression that does not constitute a criminal offence. It sounds obvious. It is obvious, which raises the question of why it needs to be said at all. Why a political party has to build a platform around the proposition that police should investigate crimes rather than non-crimes. The answer to that question is the story of British policing over the past 2 decades, of a service that was progressively captured by a diversity, equality and inclusion agenda that made its internal culture and its relationship with certain communities a higher priority than its core function of detecting and deterring crime. Lowe's platform does not ask police to be cruel. It does not ask them to abandon fairness or proportionality. It asks them to do the job they were created to do, to be in the streets where people live, to respond to break-ins, to investigate theft, to make the 94% detection failure rate a political emergency rather than a quietly accepted fact of British life. Here is the bottom line. Rupert Lowe is proposing two things that the British political establishment has decided are unsayable. The first is that publicly funded services in England should be delivered in English. That translation, infrastructure built without democratic mandate and funded without democratic consent, should be wound down, and that the £1 billion it costs should be returned to services that benefit every taxpayer equally. The second is that British policing should prioritise actual crimes, burglary, theft, violence, antisocial behaviour, over the recording and investigation of speech and expression that does not meet the threshold for prosecution. Both positions are controversial by the standards of Westminster. Both positions are completely mainstream by the standards of every other successful democratic country. The question is not whether these ideas are extreme. The question is whether Britain can afford to keep pretending they are. The 94% burglary detection rate says it cannot. The £1 billion translation bill says it cannot. Lowe is the one saying it out loud. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about. Subscribe if you want the political analysis that Westminster does not want you to have. See you in the next one.